Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Our Story Conversations with PhilDev. Our Story is a weekly web series that brings you today's most promising global Filipinos in the field of entrepreneurship and innovation. Get up close and personal with distinguished Filipino entrepreneurs, innovators, and leaders through inspiring stories of their journey towards success. The show gives us a sneak peek to the lives of these Filipinos who are leading change in the hopes of inspiring others in their own journey as aspiring innovators and entrepreneurs. So this is their story, our story. Our guest today is Randy Reyes. Randy is Google's global diversity and inclusion lead, whose thirst for empathy, understanding, and social justice informs all that he does, especially his work at Google. Growing up in the Bay Area in California as a son of immigrants from the Philippines, Randy was exposed to a diverse environment that was open to people of all classes, sexual orientations, and religions. Randy engaged in a number of outreach programs to both learn about challenges others face and leverage his skills to help. He supported students in East San Jose, California through college readiness programs, counseled those at the women's shelter, and prepared senior citizens for their American citizenship exams. So, through his community work, he gained insight into the lives of people from various backgrounds. Today, Randy will share us more about diversity and inclusion and how it is important to build a diverse community in businesses. So, hi, Randy. Good day from the Philippines. How are you? How have you been?
Hi, good morning. I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, good. How are you affected by this situation, this pandemic?
I don't quite know if much has changed in terms of my day-to-day. I do know that it's gotten a lot more busy for sure. I think in this time, especially in the diversity and inclusion space, what we see is a magnification of existing problems. And so, at the beginning of all of this in the US, there was xenophobia that was faced by the Asian community. And then shortly thereafter, in the major news sources began to see police brutality and murders of Black people in the United States. And so my work specifically really picked up, and so did the response as well.
Okay. So, Randy, into the introduction, as well as with what you just said, you've alluded to a huge issue about diversity, right? So, what diversity means to you?
I think diversity means a lot of things. I think, in the general sense, I think it means representation, especially in the workplace. And with the different types of representation, I think there comes a variety of thoughts, sexual orientations, genders, races, and different ways of looking at the world, perhaps in ways that you wouldn't had you not been otherwise exposed to or know other people of different backgrounds. So to me, that's essentially what diversity is. It's a nice representation of different perspectives coming together as one.
So, so you explained about diversity, right? How you look at it. But do you think that kind of lens is also important for businesses to look into what diversity means for them?
I think so. I mean, there's obviously been some studies that have come out. There's one notable one from McKinsey that shows that teams are better when they're more diverse. I would also say from a business perspective, businesses tend to do better because you end up tapping into markets or iterating on products in ways that you probably traditionally wouldn't have had you not had those diverse opinions. So I do think that there are business incentives, imperatives for diversity and inclusion. I also think, quite frankly, diversity is an extension of the values that a company typically has. And so if a company is going to focus on diversity and inclusion and equity in areas like this, it behooves them to have an organization that reflects that and a team that can help move that work forward.
So, in your role at Google, Randy, and with your interface with a lot of businesses, what role does inclusion play in creating diversity?
I think diversity is, an aspiration in terms of the kind of representation that you would want to see. I think inclusion is the ability for that diversity to thrive in the context that it exists. And so I see inclusion to be somewhat of an extension of belonging of sorts, in that you're creating a space, both a physical space for people to feel comfortable and safe. You're creating an emotional space for connection and connectivity to teammates, to people who look like each other, quite frankly, especially for those who are in marginalized groups. And space for new ideas that are listened to and believed and implemented because they're valued and they should be valued.
Mhm. So, will you agree that for inclusion to happen and diversity, it has to emanate from intrinsic or the internal factors within the person. And then, if you collect it together, then you generate that general emotion of inclusiveness or inclusion within the workplace. So, sorry, the reason why I'm asking all these questions because in the Philippines, we always banner inclusion and diversity, right? But sometimes it's hard for us to differentiate which goes first, and does it even which does it even have like a sequential what do you call this does it happen sequentially? That's what I'm trying to say. So you mentioned about the emotions that comes with it. So is empathy also important that drives inclusion and diversity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are three primary ways people come to the diversity and inclusion space. I think the first of which is a belief, right? So you believe it's the right thing to do, and perhaps that was, something that was a value that was instilled in you growing up. Perhaps it came from someone's religion, so on and so forth. But it's a shared value that they have as it relates to inclusion. The second is awareness and understanding, right? So maybe, for instance, they were taking a high school or college course that exposed them in ways to diversity and inclusion that they hadn't thought about. And perhaps one of the more poignant ways is around relationships, right? And I think this gets to your point around empathy. Like if you actually know someone, for instance, who doesn't have a shared identity with you, but is struggling, there's probably a higher propensity for you to participate in diverse hiring or creating an inclusive environment. I think that's born from empathy. So yeah, I would agree that empathy is a component. I don't think it's the only one, but I definitely think it's one of them for sure.
Interesting. So, Randy, just a quick question because I just remember this right now. When we talk about inclusion, they say that it's not how do you say this? It's not coincidental. Coincidental. It has to be intended, right? Is it also same thing when in Google or in the US when you talk about inclusion and diversity at the workplace or in businesses?
I mean, I think what you're talking about is actually diversity in and of itself. When you're talking about representation, perhaps in the context of gender representation in PhilDev in the Philippines,
Mm-hmm.
I would argue that in the context of inclusion in that situation,
Mm-hmm.
the real determinants are the women that are in the office and their view and whether or not they feel that they're included. I think perhaps from the outside, if you don't identify as a woman, you can say, oh yeah, I'm going to pat myself on the back because there's representation here. But just because there's representation doesn't necessarily mean that they feel welcome or, for instance, that they feel included in conversations or not spoken over, when an idea comes up or listened to for that matter. And so I think a lot of it depends on what the women say who are
Mm-hmm.
there as
Mm-hmm.
a litmus test for your success.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I agree. I agree. Of even from Philip, it's also a learning process for us. It's not just about a numbers game, right? So going back to our discussion about diversity and inclusion, especially in the business space. So what are the benefits of having a diverse community or an environment in business?
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned briefly the McKinsey study that came out that showed in terms of inclusion, um, you know, teams are better off when they're more diverse. And I also think products that a company is shipping are better. And depending on the level of engagement, with a larger society, I think there's a really large impetus or opportunity, for instance, to blaze a trail around diversity and inclusion in ways that could spark the interest for other companies to follow suit. So I think that there are a lot of benefits to diversity and inclusion in general. And I feel like they can be cultural, they can be towards someone's bottom line. Yeah, I think there are multiple ways that it can be instrumental to the success of a business.
Mhm. So Randy, there's a lot of viewers in our story with PhilDev who are founders of social enterprises, founders of startups, right? So as leaders of their own startups, how can they promote a more diverse and inclusive business environment or community?
I would argue that being a founder as a Filipino is already increasing the diversity of the pool of entrepreneurs worldwide. So what I would say is keep going and keep doing what you're doing. I think inherently, if I'm being completely honest, being Filipino, I think you end up, and especially being in America, I think you end up being super sensitized
Mhm.
to being othered. And so I think those sensitivities of how you should hire, how you should think of ideas, you're welcoming of different people, different kinds of backgrounds,
Mhm.
I think inherently is that it's going to benefit you. And so those kinds of sentiments and hints that you've had, given your power as a founder yourself, you have ability to help create even more impactful products by incorporating views of those that haven't even been given the chance to start a
Mhm.
social enterprise of sorts. And so I would just say continue doing what you're doing. Have an eye toward it because it's super critical. But do know that the more diverse your product and your workforce, like I think the more diversification and potential of your portfolio and the
Mhm.
success of your product.
Mhm. So what you're saying, Randy, is the leaders or the what do you call it, the founders of startups, they should be more consultative with their employees or their teammates, as well as with the beneficiaries or the community that they work in. Not necessarily just use whatever they're thinking, because sometimes for example in a lot of the startups that we're working with, right, especially the social enterprises, at the onset they think and they have a firm belief that because of they're a social enterprise, they already know the social impact at the start of their value chain. But what you're saying right now is there should be a continuous consultation discussions with their staff and the community. Is that correct?
I think what I'm saying is, I think there's an opportunity, especially at the jump, to
Mhm.
just build diversity into whatever it is that you're doing.
Mhm.
So if it's your board, for instance, make sure that your board has representation of people who don't look like you. If
Mhm.
it's around launching a specific product in a specific timeline, like say 1 year, don't
Mhm.
go ask people who look different than you at month 11 whether or not you think this is going to launch correctly.
Mhm. Mhm.
Have them involved during prototype or after the first iteration when you're building something out. And I would also really think of, especially as an entrepreneur, I think you have to be really resourceful. And oftentimes the best ideas come from where you just least expect it. So I
Mhm.
think the diversity of ideas reaching across sectors or industries might really help promote the work that you're doing. And so yeah, I think, staff, obviously, like the diversification of staff and things like this. But I often feel like sometimes it's hard to ask to do diversity and inclusion because, quite frankly, it's a privileged type of work to be doing full time, right?
Mhm.
But the idea around it can be embedded early on so that you're not having to deal with these types of issues later and moving forward. Um, but I think having an eye toward it is super important, and leveraging the ideas of different perspectives as you're ideating is critical.
I totally agree with that, Randy. Diversity and inclusion should not just be an afterthought, right? So, Randy, last question. How long have you been working with Google as diversity and inclusion lead?
I've been
Pretty much.
on I've been on the diversity team. I've been at Google for almost 13 years, and I've been on the diversity team for 10
Wow. So,
or
with
11 years. I can't remember.
this extensive experience, what were your primary lessons from working with people from other cultures and from other backgrounds?
I was really lucky that I grew up in the Bay Area. Like that's actually all I kind of know, like literally working with people who, quite frankly, aren't like me, like in the traditional sense, right? Best friends who are different cultures, different races, different religions, growing up in an environment with different classes. And then also even my educational experience was very varied. I went, like public school for primary and secondary, but then, for my tertiary education was primarily focused on private. And working in the nonprofit and volunteering for 15 years, I think I've seen the quintessence of what diversity and inclusion is and could be in terms of perspectives. And so it's just kind of my standard operating procedure, and that's kind of the way that I work at Google. That being said, I think I know how to work well with a lot of different kinds of people, given backgrounds and ideas and what people think are important and how to talk to them based on that, or where they are in terms of like their own learning as it relates to diversity and inclusion. And so for me, it's critical. I think it's really fun. I think it's awesome. I think it's also challenging. But I also think it's worth it, because I think the ultimate outcome is always better than if it was just me or someone who looked like me or thought like me, putting their ideas and thoughts towards something.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, Randy. So, we want to get to know. We want to know more of you by asking these rapid fire questions. Is that okay? I'm just gonna ask you some stuff. All right. So, Randy, you mentioned you're Filipino American, but what are your favorite Filipino food?
Let's see. Lumpia Shanghai is my number one. Like my number one. My mom makes amazing leche flan. I mean rice, but I don't even eat that much rice anymore. But like rice was like my staple. What else? Adobo, of course. Like we just had adobo the other week, and I had lumpia last week as well. Those are like my two staples. Every time I go home, which is like almost like before COVID, we'd go home basically every weekend. It would always be adobo and lumpia.
Do you know how to cook them yourself or no?
I know how to make all of it. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Cool. Yeah. Okay, so Randy, name your superpower.
My superpower? Let's see. I'm very intellectually curious. So I would say intellectually curious is my superpower. I think that's helped me a lot in just developing a sense of grit and just keeping on in this space. Yeah.
Okay, so what's the number one in your bucket list?
I actually look at my bucket list every 6 months, and if I'm not accomplishing something, I just go and do it. So I don't. I mean, the top of my bucket list was going to go do a doctorate. I'm starting that in the fall, so that was like my most recent one. So there.
Okay, so how many languages or dialects can you speak?
I can speak English, I can speak Spanish, and a little bit of Tagalog. So I guess 3.
Okay, well, sorry, just a personal question. Your mom and your dad are both from Manila, not necessarily from any province here.
Both of them grew up in Manila, but they also, my dad's from Bicol, and my mom's from Ilocos Sur.
Oh, wow, okay. You should learn how to speak Ilocano and Bicolano. I'm Bicolano, so it's a beautiful
wait,
language.
are we cousins? We're probably cousins.
I don't know. I mean, Philippines is 104 million Filipinos, right? Or 109 million Filipinos, but I'm sure we are for sure.
But still, I think we might be cousins. Yes.
Okay. So, Randy, if any of our viewers are interested to, get in touch with you or your group at Google, how can they find you, or how can they find your group? Do you have an email address or a website?
Yeah, I don't have a website because that's too cool. But you can email me at randy.c.reyes@gmail.com.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you so much for that. To all our viewers, don't forget to leave us a like if you find today's episode interesting. You may also leave messages in the comment section for topics that we can discuss in the future. Lastly, subscribe and follow us on PhilDev if you want to learn more about innovation and entrepreneurship. Our Facebook handle is PhilDev Foundation, or that's facebook.com/Philippine Development. Our Instagram and Twitter handles are at PhilDev_org. So watch out for a weekly episode. Again, thank you so much. Stay healthy and safe. Bye.